Welcome to the BrightWord Books podcast. BrightWord is a leading platform for diverse storytelling, where voices from all backgrounds can share their unique narratives and connect with readers from around the world. Follow our regular podcast updates, where we strive to foster a literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. Special guest, Tracy Emerick, who has authored 2 marketing books, operated a direct marketing agency for 20 years, and spent 10 years in marketing and business development consulting. He served as a state representative, moderator of his church, and chair of his town's planning board. He has also taught at several universities, and his education includes a BA in philosophy, a master's in business administration, or MBA, and a PhD in business administration. Emerick's book, Extreme Entrepreneurs, Steve Jobs and Jesus Christ, explores the soul and how it projects to others. Obviously, 2 larger-than-life figures, Steve Jobs and Jesus Christ, are examined for what each did as, quote, an extreme entrepreneur, to provide a position that has changed and will continue to change humankind. In his own words, Steve Jobs provided technology that provides, quote, a bicycle for the mind, putting complex technology in the hands of non-technical masses, while Jesus Christ converted living in fear to living in love as a way to tap the God within each of us. Dr. Emerick, welcome to the podcast. We're delighted that you're with us today. So perhaps for folks who are not familiar with the term extreme entrepreneurship, can you help us understand what do you mean by that term?
Certainly. My original idea was looking at Jesus as an entrepreneur, bringing forward new thoughts. And so I really needed to say, well, he's more than just a regular entrepreneur, and I needed a good modifier. And a good alliteration was extreme entrepreneur. So I'd like to say it was something magical, but it was really just saying, this is an entrepreneur who's done something that's really changed the world. And I say extreme entrepreneurs. Steve Jobs was also an extreme entrepreneur. Another quote of his says he wanted to put a dent in the universe. Well, he certainly did by allowing common folk like me to use technology. I mean, he really did put a dent in the universe. So my extreme entrepreneurs are those types of individuals. I mean, Elon Musk could be called an extreme entrepreneur. Walt Disney could be an extreme entrepreneur. You know, there's only a few of them. Henry Ford could be an extreme entrepreneur. People who really change societies in our country and globally. Those are the extreme entrepreneurs, and you can kind of count them on one hand. Unfortunately, all the extreme entrepreneurs seem to be men. I've been criticized for that, but I said I can't do much about that. I mean, that's just the way it is. But that's what the extreme entrepreneurs, the people who really have life-changing and ongoing effects on humanity.
Interesting. And I wonder, too, if women haven't had the same opportunity to become extreme entrepreneurs, and hopefully that will change going forward.
I certainly hope so. I mean, it's not that I have any issue with it. It's just that I can't name any right now. There may be some that are maybe still on their rise. I really don't know.
Interesting. Well, speaking of Steve Jobs, obviously a brilliant gentleman, but some have described him as perhaps difficult, even mercurial, very demanding, very specific in his objectives, and driving folks, some would say driving people too hard. And yet, by driving hard, he achieved so much. Do you find that the extreme entrepreneur, obviously they're 1 in a million or even less than that, but are they so different that perhaps they rub some people the wrong way? Some people don't know how to deal with them or don't understand them.
Absolutely. I mean, Jesus certainly rubbed people the wrong way. I mean, it cost him his life. So yeah, he was definitely an extreme entrepreneur in that sense. But Steve Jobs, unlike Jesus, was not a people person. He had a vision, he had an idea. And I actually interviewed a co-founder of his, Mr. Warren, and he said that Steve Jobs' biggest issue was once he had a goal, don't get in his way because he'd run over you, because he was very focused. So once he decided to do something, he got it done. And it didn't make him popular, and he didn't care. I mean, as long as he was accomplishing what he believed his vision was calling him to do, he was satisfied. But if you stepped out of line with him, he didn't cut you a lot of slack. After he left the company and was hired back, my understanding is he said to the operations director, he said, I really need internet access in my office. When he came back in, he didn't have the internet access. And my understanding, he fired the operations director. So, I
Wow.
mean, he didn't have a lot of patience, but he did achieve a lot. And so his vision was something that you couldn't explain. And so his hiring profile, he tried people who had the resumes of this and that, something else. But what he discovered was if he put somebody in front of their latest invention or process or whatever they were doing, and they got excited about it, he hired them because he said, I can teach people to do something, but I can't teach them to have the attitude or the interest in what we're doing. So he was really looking for people, and it worked for him because I think his head of operations, for production, the head of production was actually an accountant that kind of grew into the job. So it's like, well, she believes in my dream, so let's give her a chance. And he was very successful with his hiring profile, obviously very successful with his product development.
Absolutely. And as we know, he had, unfortunately, a short lifetime, relatively, cut down by disease at a relatively young age.
Yes.
And perhaps if he hadn't driven so fast and so hard, he wouldn't have accomplished everything that he did while he was with us.
Well, plus he was always a little hard-headed about his treatments too. He kind of decided to do holistic treatments for his affliction, and it didn't pay off. That was one gamble that he did. It didn't work for him.
Interesting. Interesting. You talk about Jesus as a social entrepreneur. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, where Steve Jobs was interested in developing a product that helped humans, Jesus was more interested in helping humans. So he was a one-on-one social navigator. And a lot of his stories had to do with non-Jewish people. The Sumerians seemed to be important to him. There's one episode about the woman at the well, and that was in Samaria. And he was from Judah and talking to a Sumerian woman alone at the well. She was unchaperoned, which all of that are absolutely the wrong things to do. So he reached out to her, he helped her. That was his style, was to help people. And I have actually had some very interesting feedback on that book. I had a woman contact me and she said, I grew up Catholic and I believe in God. She said, but you have made Jesus into a human for me. For my whole life, Jesus was somebody obviously hanging up on a cross or was over there or in that building. But she said, you made Jesus a human. And I'm glad that was my point, because Jesus basically was a nice guy. I mean, he would talk with anybody. He loved kids. He didn't discriminate at all. I mean, he was even nice to the Pharisees. So he was just a good guy. And if we could have that relationship with God, that will help us understand that we have God within us that we have to listen to. And all he tried to do was bring it out in people and get them to take a step closer to understanding themselves. And that's why he was such an effective leader. I mean, he took 12 men, ultimately just 11, but he taught them this message of humanity, and they carried it forth. And now there's 1.2 billion Christians, approximately. I don't think I have an exact number, but there's quite a few worldwide. So he was definitely into, we would call it today social engineering, but it was social engineering around the society that he entered was a society of fear. His population was controlled by the Romans. They were fearful of the Romans. Their church had a rule for everything. So they were fearful of their church. And Jesus said, fear not. And he told them to love, not fear. And he said to love yourself as your neighbor. And a lot of people have interpreted that one now for generations and said, well, does that mean love your enemies? And it absolutely does. So that was his common denominator. He never varied. He didn't have any exceptions to the rule. He didn't practice any exceptions to the rule, and he taught that as the way to move forward. So that's grand social engineering. Just love each other and yourself.
Wow. And so simple and yet so powerful.
Right.
Wow. At the risk of sounding sacrilegious, I think some young people today, if you ask them what's more important to you, your iPhone or your religion, they might have to think about that for a moment.
Most of them would say my iPhone.
Maybe they wouldn't think about it, and unfortunately, that may or may not say something about the world we live in these days. But it's clearly an indicator of just how influential both men were, especially Steve Jobs. His changed the world, and of
Right.
course, Jesus Christ changed the world. And so, both of them very impactful in their time on Earth.
But to that end, John, there's one thing that we have done as a society, and what we've done is we've partitioned the world into pieces. Like if you ask that individual, that youth, how important is your iPhone? But if you put them in a church building, they might have a different answer. Because what we've done is we've said you have three lives. You have your home life, you have your work life or school life, and you have your church life. And it's kind of like never the twain shall meet. Because I had somebody ask me, how does this apply to business, Jesus Christ and Steve Jobs? And I said, you're not getting it. That's the whole point, is that what they provided us were tools and messages for our life at home, at work and school, and in church. And so what we have to do is we have to figure out how to put that together in ourselves, because we partition ourselves too. And so that's why I'm not picking on the teenagers, because they've grown up petitioned. And so what we have to do is get rid of the partitioning. That's tough to say. And I've spoken with this to my pastor many times, and I'm saying, we got to get out of this building, because it's not that many people standing at the front door beating it down. We got to go out into the population and deliver the message that Jesus is a nice guy. Maybe you ought to come see if you can get to know him a little better.
I love it. I love it. So true. Dr. Emerick, what can you explain a little bit for our viewers? What was the process of researching for the book and gathering information?
Well, clearly online research. I mean, you go in and you watch some. Steve Jobs gave a great speech at a commencement in California that was a masterful commencement speech, where he talked about connecting the dots of your life. And the thing about connecting the dots is you got to go backwards. You can't forecast the connecting the dots. It's something that you live with. But there was a book written about him, that's a giant book. It's big and it's thick and it's got a lot of details. So that was my primary resource, was other printed material. I actually at one point had Apple as a client and went out to Sunnyvale. I think that's where they are. I went to California to their headquarters, and I didn't, not this new one that they have, this new one, this gigantic thing with all glass. I've never been there, but I'm talking about the old headquarters. So I love Apple products. And so when going to the home office, it's like, wow, this is really great.
Absolutely.
But I mean, I'm using an Apple iMac right now, so it's still with me.
Absolutely. What surprised you the most? And what do you think would surprise your reader the most who picks up the book?
I think what surprises the reader first is the title. I've had more comment just about the title of Extreme Entrepreneur Steve Jobs and Jesus Christ. People go like this. They go, oh my gosh, you can't put those two in the same sentence. And I said, well, that's the whole point. You can put those two in the same sentence because they both reached out to humanity in some sense in a grand way. So why can't you put them in the same sense? So once you get people past the title and they get into the book and they start looking at the similarities of the lifestyles and interpersonal skills of the two individuals, then they can understand. One was about a thing and one was about people. So, most of our discussions are either people or things. It's like the grand symbolism of Steve Jobs being about things, Jesus Christ being about people. And their stories do meld because of their commitment to their beliefs.
Absolutely. Yeah, I must admit, I thought it was a provocative title, and until I began looking into it and realizing what you mean and what you're sharing, I thought, wow, that's an interesting title for a book. But what do you think if Steve Jobs was here today and he saw that new Apple campus, and saw what's happened since he left us, and if Christ was back on earth as a person, as a nice guy, what do you think their advice would be? Do you think their messages would be the same?
Absolutely. I don't think they would vary one iota. I mean, I think Steve Jobs would kind of like the new headquarters, but he couldn't care less. His question is going to be, what about product development? How have you advanced the product? How have you improved the product? How have you improved utilization? On and on and on. And Jesus' questions would be the same. How are you loving your neighbor? How are you loving yourself? They would be in step. Jesus would probably have a different attire today, but by and large, they would be the exact same people. I don't think they would change at all.
Interesting. Interesting. And perhaps that's why, in a sense, they both live on, at least the memory and the inspiration that each of them brought to the world continues to inspire and continues to make a difference in people's lives.
And it still does. I mean, I would bet that everybody that has an iPhone looks at it at least once a day, if not multiple times in a day. So we're carrying that technology now around like our car keys. I've got my iPhone and I've got my car keys. I'm good to go.
That's right.
It's ubiquitous, especially for people like me who have, Apple products. I'm always appreciative. I would think that Steve Jobs would probably be looking at, what rev are we on the software, and what improvements have you made? And there's been little tiny improvements all along, and we don't realize it because we buy the next iPhone and it's got a few more this and that, something else, and cameras and blah 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 blah. But it's incremental, and now we've got in our hands a powerhouse of a tool.
Absolutely.
Like my son-in-law used to, when they went out skiing and stuff, would carry cameras. Nobody carries a camera anymore. They carry their phone, and they take all the pictures with their phone.
With 12 megapixels, you couldn't buy a better camera, right?
That's right, and it fits in your pocket.
And
Yeah,
somebody told me too that the amount of computing power in our pocket today is far greater than what they went to the moon with on the
absolutely,
Apollo mission.
absolutely.
It's
It's
just
it's not
amazing.
it's not, and the storage capacity, is mind blowing compared even compared to what the original iPhones were like. I mean, the amount of storage we have now, plus a lot of it we shoot up to the cloud and all that, which I don't understand at all. I just know it's there and it says it's in the cloud. Good, okay. I want it from the cloud. Bring it back.
And I think that would be music to Steve Jobs' ears because he didn't want you to have to worry about it.
That's
He
right.
wanted it to be technology that is easy to use and is thoughtfully designed. And I think it does that. It's amazing. Makes our lives easier, and we just don't we take it so much for granted these days.
That's true.
What one thing would you hope that reader would take away from the book? If they remember just one item from reading the book, what would that be?
It would be that neither Jesus nor Steve Jobs invented anything. They reorganized things or organized or, bundled things together that were atypical, but they weren't inventors. Most people look at entrepreneuring as inventing. I mean, Walt Disney didn't invent parks, entertainment parks. He didn't invent that. He just turned it into a masterful destination resort. In the cartoon, he didn't invent cartoons. He advanced cartoons using the technology, but he didn't say anything. They didn't do anything that was brand new. They took something that was there and re-engineered it. And that's really my
Amen.
message to everybody. You don't have to invent something to be an entrepreneur. You just have to have an idea that brings value to others. And if your value is better than somebody else that's doing what you're doing, it could be making pizza, it could be making cookies, it could be mowing grass, it could be anything. But if you do it better than somebody else, you're going to capture some business. And that's what entrepreneuring is all about. I mean, entrepreneuring is the purest form of capitalism. My idea, I'm going to take it to the market, and the market either accepts it or it doesn't. And so you either fail or you go get another idea.
Exactly. And as we see on the television show Shark Tank, very often the people that get lucrative deals are those that have a better way, have built a better mousetrap. uh,
Absolutely.
a better way to do something or clean something or cook something or on and on and on.
And when you see them and you look at those things, you say, why didn't I think of that?
Exactly. It could have been me. It could have been
That's
me.
right. All I got to do is think sometimes.
Exactly. Well,
But the
Dr. Emerick, it has been an
other side of
absolute
it,
pleasure. Yes,
I'm saying the other side of it is entrepreneuring is not just business oriented. It can be your contribution to a church or a nonprofit organization or to a baseball league. I mean, so entrepreneuring is actually, no pun intended here, moving the ball forward in some senses and providing new ideas or new thought process. That's also entrepreneuring. So it doesn't have to be either earth shattering or have dollars at the end of it. Because the interesting thing about Steve Jobs and Jesus Christ, neither one of them cared about money. It's never crossed their mind anything about money. So that's the good news about entrepreneuring. It doesn't have to have money as its ultimate goal. It can be a byproduct, certainly, but entrepreneuring for us on a daily basis can apply to all the interactions we have with others.
indeed. Indeed. Valuable insights for all of us. And I think bottom line, make a difference, right? Leave the world a better place than you found it.
That's it. Pretty simple.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And I assume, Doctor, that the book is available on Amazon and other major retailers?
Yes, online retailers. I also have a website, theleadershipfrontier.com, where I'm starting to have some interviews. One of is this interview with the co-founder of Apple Computer, and also some explanation because there are actually 4 books in the series. This is one of the 4. The other 3 are also individuals in relationship with Jesus Christ. So let me just tell you what they are.
Absolutely.
Consummate Coaches, Bill Belichick and Jesus Christ. Nifty Neighbors, Mr. Rogers and Jesus Christ. And Constant Courage, Martin Luther King Jr. and Jesus Christ. So all 4 books deal with a different individual that is noteworthy and their interaction with Jesus and not their interaction, but their similarities to those characteristics that Jesus taught and had. So it's a 4-book series. You can read them individually; they're each standalone, but there is a reference to the soul. Because in the first book, in the Extreme Entrepreneurs book, I do talk about the soul, and that for Steve Jobs, his mission was in his soul, and your mind is the theater of your soul. His vision was something he could see, but he had a tough time explaining it to people. It's kind of like trying to tell somebody what chocolate tastes like. I mean, Steve Jobs could only kind of intimate and point and talk, and people that were with him said, "Okay, boss, let's go do it. Whatever you're talking about, we'll give it a go." And basically, it's the same thing that the disciples had. I mean, when they put down their fish nets or their tax, ledgers and stuff, and they said, "Okay, Jesus, let's go for it. We're not real sure where you're going, but we're with you." And so their visions were in their soul, and they transmitted that to our souls. And so once we get it, so to speak, all of a sudden our brain goes, aha, I got it. So, and that's a great moment for all of us.
Ab- Absolutely. Well, we'll have to look for all of those books. Each of the titles sounds very intriguing, especially Mr. Rogers, one of the kids' favorites. So
Absolutely. I mean, Mr. Rogers, when I wanted to write a book about being friendly and when working with people and stuff, Mr. Rogers came to my mind immediately because when my kids were growing up, it was the real Mr. Rogers. Today, it's a cartoon Mr. Rogers. But that show was so low key. After watching Sesame Street with all the bouncing and the colors and the characters, and then you go to Mr. Rogers. He said a guy comes put on a cardigan sweater and some sneakers, and he just sits there and talk in a nice, pleasant voice, and the kids loved him. So I guess it doesn't take Sesame Street, but Mr. Rogers was enthralling for those kids.
exactly, and folks our age remember him.
Oh yeah,
He made an impression.
yes. The interesting thing is the people who actually saw Mr. Roger live are like us. getting older. So I'm going to have to get that book in the market quick.
That's right. You don't want to lose your audience.
That's right. Or I'll say, reference Mr. Rogers, see YouTube.
That's right. If you don't know who he is, please research first.
That's right.
Well, this has been terrific. We've been speaking with Dr. Tracy Emerick, author of Extreme Entrepreneurs, Steve Jobs and Jesus Christ, an intriguing title and a very intriguing book, a series of books, actually. Dr. Emerick, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. You've been listening to the BrightWord Books Podcast, home of the literary community that celebrates creativity, inclusivity, and the transformative power of literature. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss future episodes. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.